Miles Davis walked into a small church on Sunday morning and started singing gospel. What happened next shocked everyone. The man, known for his cool, restrained trumpet playing and his sometimes aloof stage presence, revealed a completely different side of himself that morning, one that even his closest friends had never seen. His voice, rich and soulful, filled the sanctuary with an emotion so genuine and powerful that it transformed not just the service, but everyone who witnessed this unexpected moment of spiritual vulnerability. It was a crisp Sunday morning in October 1963, and Miles Davis was walking through the streets of Harlem, lost in thought about the direction his music was taking. He had been experimenting with new sounds, working with his second great quintet, and feeling restless about the conventional boundaries of jazz performance. The weight of constant innovation, the pressure of maintaining his status as a leading figure in modern music, and the complexity of navigating the changing social landscape of the early 1960s had left him feeling spiritually disconnected. As Miles walked down 125th Street, the sound of gospel music drifted from a small storefront church he had passed countless times but never entered. Mount Olive Baptist Church was one of those intimate community sanctuaries that served as both a spiritual and social center for the neighborhood. This particular morning, the congregation was in the middle of their worship service, and the sound of their voices raised in unison created something that stopped Miles in his tracks. The choir was singing Amazing Grace, but not in the polished performance style that Miles was accustomed to hearing in concert halls or on recordings. This was raw, authentic worship, voices blending not because they were trained to do so, but because they were moved by genuine faith and community spirit. There was something in that sound that reached a part of Miles's soul that had been dormant for years. Miles stood on the sidewalk for several minutes, listening to the music that seemed to carry everything he had been missing in his professional life: authenticity, spiritual connection, and the kind of musical communication that didn't require technical sophistication to move people's hearts. Without fully understanding why, Miles found himself walking up the 3 steps to the church's front door. He hesitated for a moment, wondering whether he belonged in this sacred space, whether his presence would be welcome, whether he could participate in something so personal and communal. The door was open, as it always was during services, and Miles stepped quietly into the back of the sanctuary. The church was small, maybe 60 people filled the wooden pews, and the atmosphere was intimate and welcoming. No one turned to stare at the famous musician who had just entered. They were too absorbed in their worship to notice anything beyond the spiritual moment they were sharing. Miles slipped into a pew in the back row, next to an elderly woman who smiled and nodded at him with the kind of automatic warmth that characterized the community's approach to welcoming strangers. He sat quietly, listening to the preacher's sermon about finding grace in unexpected places, about how God's love could reach anyone who opened their heart to receive it. As the service continued, Miles felt something stirring inside him that he hadn't experienced in years. The music, the sense of community, the genuine spiritual energy in the room. It was everything that his professional musical life lacked. Here, music wasn't about technical virtuosity or artistic innovation. It was about expressing faith, hope, and love in the most direct way possible. When the preacher called for the congregation to join in singing "Swing Low, Sweet Chariot," Miles found himself caught between wanting to participate and feeling uncertain about whether he had the right to join in. These weren't his people, this wasn't his church, and he hadn't been a regular participant in organized worship for most of his adult life. But as the congregation began to sing, something deep within Miles responded to the call. He had grown up hearing these songs. His grandmother had sung them to him as a child. His mother had hummed them while she worked around the house, and they were woven into the fabric of his earliest musical memories. Almost without realizing it, Miles began to hum along quietly. His voice, which few people outside of his immediate family had ever heard, was rich and warm, carrying the kind of emotional depth that his trumpet playing was famous for, but in a completely different register. The elderly woman sitting next to him heard him humming and looked over with a smile of encouragement. "Sing out, child," she whispered, The Lord wants to hear your voice." That simple invitation was all Miles needed. As the congregation moved into the second verse of Swing Low, Sweet Chariot, Miles began to sing with full voice. His years of musical training, his understanding of harmony and rhythm, and most importantly, his deep emotional connection to the spiritual tradition that had shaped American music, all came together in a sound that was both technically beautiful and spiritually authentic. The effect on the congregation was immediate and profound. Heads began to turn as people realized that something extraordinary was happening in their small sanctuary. The voice joining their familiar song wasn't just another congregation member, it was something special, something that elevated the entire musical experience to a level they had rarely encountered. Miles wasn't performing. He wasn't showing off his musical abilities or trying to impress anyone with his technical skills. He was simply participating in the worship service as a fellow believer, adding his voice to the community's expression of faith and hope. The choir director, a woman named Sister Margaret, who had been leading music at Mount Olive for 20 years, noticed the remarkable addition to their sound and began to adjust the arrangement subtly to accommodate the beautiful bass baritone voice that was enriching their worship. She had no idea that the man singing in the back row was one of the most famous musicians in the world. She only knew that his voice was adding something powerful and moving to their service. As the song continued, Miles found himself experiencing something he hadn't felt in years of professional performance. This wasn't about impressing an audience or demonstrating his artistic abilities. This was about connecting with something larger than himself, about being part of a community united in faith and mutual support. When Swing Low, Sweet Chariot ended, the sanctuary was filled with a profound silence. The congregation could sense that they had just experienced something special, something that had transformed their regular Sunday service into something memorable and sacred. Pastor Williams, who had been leading the Mount Olive congregation for 15 years, recognized that this moment called for acknowledgement. He looked toward the back of the church, where Miles was sitting, and said, "Brother, that was a beautiful addition to our worship this morning. Would you be willing to share another song with us?" Miles felt a moment of panic. In jazz clubs, he was in control of the musical situation. He knew the songs, he knew the other musicians, and he understood exactly what was expected of him. But here, in this sacred space, he was being asked to contribute without any of his usual technical support systems. But the warmth and acceptance he felt from the congregation gave him the courage to respond positively. Miles stood up and said, "I'd like to sing Amazing Grace, if that's all right with everyone." The response was immediate and enthusiastic. Amazing Grace was the song that had drawn him into the church in the first place, and now he was being invited to lead the congregation in singing it. Miles walked to the front of the church, not to the pulpit or the choir area, but to a position where he could face the congregation and join his voice with theirs, rather than performing for them. As he began to sing the opening lines of Amazing Grace, his voice carried all the emotion and spiritual yearning that had been building throughout the service. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound, that saved a wretch like me. The congregation joined in, but they followed Miles's lead, allowing his interpretation to guide the rhythm and emotional tenor of the song. Miles sang with the same kind of emotional restraint and careful phrasing that characterized his trumpet playing, but with a vulnerability and openness that he rarely showed in his professional performances. As the song continued, Miles found himself thinking about his own spiritual journey, about the grace that had sustained him through the challenges of his career and personal life, about the community support that had made his musical development possible. The words of the hymn weren't just traditional religious language to him. They were expressions of his own experience of redemption and spiritual growth. When the song ended, the congregation erupted in applause and expressions of gratitude. "Amen. Praise the Lord. That was beautiful, brother." The responses came from throughout the sanctuary, reflecting the genuine appreciation and spiritual connection that Miles's singing had created. Pastor Williams approached Miles with tears in his eyes. "Brother, I don't know who you are, but you've brought something special to our worship this morning." That was the voice of someone who understands what grace really means. Miles was moved by the pastor's words, but even more moved by the realization that he had found something in this small church that he had been searching for in his professional life: authentic spiritual and musical connection that wasn't about technical achievement, but about genuine human communication. As the service continued, Miles participated in every song, adding his voice to hymns he remembered from childhood and learning new ones from the congregation around him. For the first time in years, he was making music not as Miles Davis, the jazz innovator, but as Miles Davis, the human being seeking spiritual connection and community. After the service ended, dozens of congregation members approached Miles to thank him for his contribution to their worship. They didn't know he was a famous musician. They simply appreciated that he had shared his gift with their community in a spirit of genuine worship and fellowship. Sister Margaret, the choir director, invited Miles to return the following Sunday and consider joining their choir on a regular basis. "We'd love to have your voice as part of our musical ministry," she said. "You understand what worship music is really about." Miles was touched by the invitation, and while his touring schedule wouldn't allow him to be a regular participant, he promised to return whenever he was in New York and not performing elsewhere. As Miles walked home that morning, he reflected on how the experience had affected him. The spiritual connection he had felt, the sense of community, and the opportunity to use his musical gifts in service of something larger than his own artistic ambitions had reminded him of why he had started making music in the first place. Over the following months, Miles did return to Mount Olive Baptist Church whenever his schedule allowed. He never announced his visits in advance, and he always sat in the back and participated as a regular congregation member rather than as a special guest. The church community came to treasure these visits, not because of his fame, but because of the sincerity and spiritual depth he brought to their worship. The experience at Mount Olive also influenced Miles's approach to his professional music. He began to incorporate some of the emotional directness and spiritual authenticity he had experienced in gospel music into his jazz compositions and performances. The result was music that maintained his technical sophistication while adding a new level of emotional and spiritual depth. Years later, when music journalists and biographers would ask Miles about the spiritual influences on his music, he would often reference his experiences singing gospel at Mount Olive Baptist Church. "That's where I remembered that music is about more than technique and innovation," he would say. "It's about connecting with people's souls, about expressing things that are too deep for words." The congregation at Mount Olive never publicized the fact that Miles Davis had been a regular participant in their worship services. To them, he was simply Brother Miles, a member of their spiritual community who happened to have a beautiful voice and a genuine heart for worship. The lesson from Miles's experience at Mount Olive extends beyond music to anyone seeking authentic spiritual connection and community. Sometimes the most profound spiritual experiences come not from seeking them deliberately, but from being open to the unexpected moments when grace finds us in the most ordinary circumstances. Miles's willingness to step into that small church, to participate in worship as a fellow believer rather than as a performer, and to use his musical gifts in service of something larger than his own artistic ambitions, demonstrated that true spiritual growth often requires the humility to become a student again, to join communities rather than lead them, and to use our talents not for personal recognition but for the benefit of others. If this incredible story of spiritual awakening and authentic worship inspired you, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Share this video with someone who needs to understand that the most profound spiritual experiences often come when we're willing to step outside our comfort zones and join communities in authentic worship. Have you ever experienced an unexpected moment of spiritual connection that changed your perspective? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to check out more stories about the moments when music becomes a bridge between the human and the divine.